The lounge smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. Outside the window, sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating the neat rows of garden chairs and the slow shuffle of elderly residents who seemed to have nowhere left to rush to. George Miller sat with his suitcase by his feet, the same brown leather bag he'd taken to work for 30 years straight. His hands rested on his knees, the veins pronounced, his posture straight despite the weight in his chest. Across the room, his son Mark stood at the front desk with the facility administrator, discussing something quietly but efficiently, as if finalizing a transaction, not leaving his father in someone else's care. George could still hear snippets of the conversation. "Yes, private suite. The insurance will handle it," Mark said, tapping the pen against the clipboard impatiently. The administrator smiled in that professional, distant way. "We'll make sure your father is comfortable here, Mr. Miller." George's eyes lingered on the back of his son's tailored grey suit. He'd bought Mark his first one years ago for a job interview fresh out of college. The memory came uninvited like a knife with a dull edge. Mark turned finally, walking toward him, his expression rehearsed, a mix of forced sympathy and convenience. "Dad, it's better for you here," he said gently. "You'll be looked after. You'll have company. It's peaceful." George met his gaze. His voice was low, controlled. "Care or convenience, son?" Mark's lips parted for a second, then closed. His eyes flickered away toward the papers he held. "You know it's hard for me to visit every day with work and all. This is what's best." George nodded slightly. "For who?" Mark didn't answer. He just sighed, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, authorization documents. "Just sign these. It'll make things easier." The word easier hung in the air like a heavy weight. George looked around. 2 older men played cards at a nearby table. One of them watched the exchange quietly, shaking his head in quiet understanding. Another woman in a wheelchair gave him a sympathetic smile, the kind that said, "I've been left too." He took the pen, his hand steady despite the tremor of his heart, and signed where his son pointed. "Thank you," Mark said quickly, his voice brisk again, already glancing toward the door. George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn business card, the same one Mark had given him years ago when he started his company. Miller Real Estate Group, building tomorrow. The ink had faded slightly, but the pride it once carried hadn't. He folded it carefully between his fingers, the edges soft from time. Mark checked his phone. "I'll come by next weekend," he said casually, already turning away. George looked up at him. "Do you remember when your mother and I used to drive out every Saturday to visit your grandmother?" Mark hesitated, uneasy. "That was different, Dad." George tilted his head slightly. "It always is." Mark didn't reply. He just muttered something about work and deadlines, then patted his father on the shoulder. That brief, detached kind of touch that feels more like an obligation than affection. As Mark walked out, the administrator approached with the final paperwork. "Mr. Miller, if you could just sign here for your intake." George nodded, the pen feeling heavier this time. He signed his name again, slower now, his hand trembling slightly as the ink spread across the line. The sound of the door closing echoed behind him. He didn't look back. The administrator smiled politely and said something about meal schedules, laundry pickup, visiting hours. George nodded, hearing none of it. He looked down at the folded business card still in his hand. He turned it over once, then tucked it back into his jacket pocket. From outside, faint laughter drifted in through the open window, residents sharing stories, jokes, fragments of the lives they once had. George stood and walked slowly toward the window, resting his hands on the sill. He watched a nurse help an old man water the flowers. He noticed how gently she spoke, how careful she was not to make him feel helpless. It struck George. That care was something you couldn't buy or sign for. It came from respect, not paperwork. Behind him, one of the older residents called out softly, "First day, huh?" George turned and smiled faintly. "Guess so." The man nodded knowingly. "You'll get used to it, or maybe not." George's eyes flicked toward the door where Mark had exited just minutes ago. The faint imprint of his footsteps still seemed to echo in the hall. He sat down again, the leather of his chair creaking under his weight. The folded business card pressed against his chest inside his jacket pocket, sharp against his heart. He closed his eyes for a long moment, exhaling slowly. Then, in a quiet voice that no one heard but him, he said, "He thought he left me to fade quietly. Instead, he left me where my second life would begin." The soft hum of the air conditioner filled George's room that night. The faint ticking of the wall clock echoed against the quiet. Slow, deliberate, steady. It reminded him of another rhythm, one from years ago when life was simpler, filled with laughter that felt real. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the small lamp casting a weak glow across the table. On it sat a framed photo of his wife, Linda, smiling, young, radiant, frozen in a time before things started falling apart. He could still hear her voice from that hospital bed, faint but steady as she said, "Promise me you'll never let Mark forget who he is." He had promised her that day, and for a while he kept that promise like a sacred vow. George had spent 35 years as an electrician, the kind of man people called when things went dark, both in homes and in their lives. He worked with his hands, his back, and his word. There were no shortcuts in his world, just long days and honest pay. When Linda got sick, he sold his old truck to help pay her medical bills. He took extra shifts, walking home under flickering streetlights long after everyone else had gone to bed. She never complained. Even in her weakest days, she smiled and said, "You'll see, Georgie. Everything you gave will come back to you in ways you won't expect." After she passed, the house went silent. The only thing that gave him purpose was Mark. Every morning he'd pack lunches for the both of them, drive him to school, and promise that life would keep getting better. He made sure of it. He worked overtime, saved every dollar, and put Mark through business school. He bought him his first used car, helped him furnish his first apartment, and wrote checks for every tuition fee, even when it meant skipping meals to make the payments on time. When Mark graduated, George stood beside him for a photo in front of the university sign. Mark had wrapped an arm around his father and said, "Couldn't have done it without you, Dad." George still carried that photo in his wallet. The edges were worn now, but the pride in his son's eyes hadn't faded. Somewhere along the way, things began to shift. It wasn't sudden, just small moments that changed the air between them. Mark started wearing tailored suits, speaking with the tone of someone who'd stopped looking back. Their weekly calls became monthly ones. Their visits shortened from weekends to hours. At dinners, George noticed how Mark introduced him to new colleagues. "This is my dad, the old school guy," he'd say with a little laugh, like it was a harmless joke. Everyone else would laugh too. George would smile, but inside it hurt in ways he didn't know how to explain. Mark's wife, Claire, was polite but distant. She'd scroll on her phone during conversations or smile awkwardly when George talked about his work. Once, during Thanksgiving, when a light in their dining room started flickering, George offered to fix it. Claire had smiled tightly and said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll get someone professional to handle it." He said nothing, just nodded and went back to eating his meal quietly, pretending the turkey didn't taste like dust in his mouth. Over time, family dinners became rare. Phone calls turned into texts. Birthdays became reminders on social media. The house that once felt full of life now echoed with silence and old memories. And yet, despite the distance, George never stopped feeling proud of Mark. He told himself that growing apart was just part of life, that success came with its own distractions. But deep down, a quiet ache lingered, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, his son had started to see him as a burden instead of a blessing. One afternoon, while sitting by the garden window of the retirement home, George heard a soft voice behind him. "You don't look like a man who belongs here," a woman said. He turned to see a nurse standing nearby, maybe in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a patient smile. Her name tag read, Linda. The coincidence almost made him laugh. "I'm told I'll get used to it," he replied, his voice gentle but tired. She tilted her head slightly. "Some people do, some don't. You don't strike me as the type who stays still." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't." She studied him for a moment. "You built things, didn't you?" George nodded. "Most of my life. Things that worked. Things that mattered." Her eyes softened. "Then you'll build something again. Maybe not with tools this time, maybe with time." That line stayed with him long after she walked away. He looked out through the window at the rows of cars pulling in and out of the parking lot, thinking about how people measure worth. Some count it in money, others in titles, but as he sat there watching the sunset paint the sky gold, he thought of his father's words he hadn't thought of in years. "A man's worth isn't in what he earns, it's in what he leaves behind." That night, as the lights dimmed and the hallways went quiet, George whispered to himself, "If the world measures worth by money, I'll rebuild mine through value no one can price." The next morning, George sat by the dining hall window watching the trays of breakfast roll out one by one. The smell of burnt toast drifted through the air, and the eggs, cold and rubbery, looked like they'd been cooked hours ago. Across from him, a frail woman poked at her food with a trembling fork, mumbling, "They forget to warm it again." He forced a small smile, but inside, something twisted. It wasn't just the food. It was the indifference. The nurses looked tired, the hallways were dim, and the same flickering light outside his door hadn't been fixed in weeks. He'd seen neglect before, in business, in life, in people who stop caring because it's easier that way. But this felt different. It wasn't just laziness, it was profit wrapped in politeness. Later that afternoon, Nurse Linda found him sitting on a bench outside the common room. She had that same calm expression, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "Rough morning?" she asked, handing him a cup of coffee. He nodded slowly. "Coffee's good. Food's not." She laughed lightly. "You get used to it. We all do." He turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Why? Don't they have the budget for decent meals?" Her smile faded. "They do. Or they used to. They say the owner's cashing out soon. Doesn't care anymore." He looked at her, the words settling like a weight in his chest. "Who's the owner?" She shrugged, glancing toward the main office. "Some investor group from the city. They don't visit. They just send new rules and cutbacks." George nodded, but his mind was already turning. The same quiet fire he used to feel when something wasn't right. That old instinct hadn't died with retirement, it was only sleeping. That evening, while the others watched television, he sat in his room with the dim lamp casting shadows across the desk. He opened a small, worn notebook and began writing. April 8th. Lunch served late. Half the plates cold. One patient, Mrs. Lawn, left waiting 40 minutes for assistance. Staff apologized, said short-staffed again. He flipped to a new page and wrote another line. April 10th. Maintenance issue in hallway light unresolved for 12 days. Manager said, "We'll get to it." It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about purpose. For the first time in months, he felt his mind alive again. Methodical, precise, alert. Days turned into weeks, and the notebook grew thicker. He noticed patterns. Supply trucks arriving less frequently, cleaners skipping rooms, staff cycles increasing. The facility was running on fumes, but the residents were still being charged premium rates. One morning, while helping another resident adjust a broken wheelchair brake, George caught a glimpse of invoices left on a desk. The same supplier listed 3 times, but each with different amounts for identical deliveries. His jaw tightened. Someone was skimming. That evening, he mentioned it quietly to Linda in the hallway. "I think someone's siphoning money," he whispered. Her eyes widened. "George, please, don't get involved. The last nurse who asked questions got transferred overnight." He nodded slowly, but there was no stopping now. "Someone has to care enough to look." She hesitated, then sighed. "If you're really going to do this, be careful. This place has shadows and they don't like being seen." He smiled faintly. "I've worked in dark places before." The next day, the manager, a slick man in his 40s with a smile too polished to be sincere, called him into the office. "Mr. Miller," he began, "I've been hearing you've been taking notes. George didn't flinch. Just observations. The manager leaned forward. You're here to rest, not investigate. We handle things our way. George's voice was calm but steady. Maybe that's why nothing ever changes. The room fell silent for a beat. Then the manager smirked and said, You're lucky you're a resident, not staff. Otherwise that attitude might get you removed. George stood up, buttoned his jacket, and gave a small nod. Then it's a good thing I don't work here. I'd hate to have to report to someone who's afraid of truth. That night he sat back in his room, notebook open, heart steady. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was focused. Every word he wrote felt like a seed planted for something bigger. He started talking quietly with other residents, learning their stories. Many had similar complaints, missing funds, lost belongings, medical requests ignored. He listened, documented, and promised nothing except honesty. Linda brought him extra coffee during her breaks, whispering updates about staff turnover and missing supplies. You really are stirring things up, George, she said one afternoon, half smiling. He chuckled softly. I'm not stirring anything, I'm just watching, carefully. Late one night, he looked out through his window and saw a luxury car pull up to the back entrance. 2 men in suits got out, carrying briefcases. They stayed only 10 minutes before leaving again. The next morning, the cafeteria ran out of milk, and Linda quietly mentioned that payroll had been delayed again. George flipped open his notebook, his pen gliding across the page as he whispered to himself, They think we're old and blind, but we've been watching longer than they've been alive. He closed the notebook, set it beside the folded business card of Miller Real Estate Group, building tomorrow, and let out a slow, steady breath. The same son who put him here to fade away had no idea his father was already building something again. Quietly, patiently, one truth at a time. The next week brought a quiet rhythm that felt purposeful again. George moved through the retirement home not as a resident but as an observer, calm, careful, collecting truth. Each word written in his notebook now had meaning. Each small injustice had a witness. Then, one afternoon, while reading the newspaper in the common area, he noticed a familiar name in the business section. Robert Hayes, retired accountant and financial consultant, now advising an investment group specializing in undervalued care facilities. The article mentioned how Hayes had turned struggling senior homes into community-run success stories. George leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming. Robert had been one of his oldest friends. They hadn't spoken in nearly 15 years. He'd helped Robert rewire his first office back in the day when both men were still trying to build something that mattered. That evening, George borrowed Linda's phone under the pretense of making a short call. He dialed the old number, half expecting it to be disconnected. Instead, a familiar voice answered, Hayes here. George hesitated, then said, Still using your last name like it's a business logo, huh? There was silence, then a low chuckle. George Miller. I'll be damned. They spoke for nearly an hour. George told him everything. The neglect, the cutbacks, the invoices that didn't add up. He mentioned the corporate ownership, the whispered rumors of an investor group bleeding the place dry before selling it off. Robert listened carefully. You've still got that mind for detail. You kept notes? George nodded. Every day. Dates, names, patterns, even photos. Robert's tone turned serious. Send me everything. I'll have my team review it. You might be sitting on more than you think. When they ended the call, George sat for a long time staring at the folded business card on his nightstand. Miller Real Estate Group, building tomorrow. He thought about how his son saw him as old and finished, while another man from his past still saw him as capable. 3 days later, Robert arrived at the facility in person. His hair was thinner now, his gait slower, but his eyes still sharp. When he stepped into George's room, the 2 men shook hands like no time had passed at all. Robert laughed softly. You still fix things, huh? George smiled, eyes glinting. Some things still need wiring back together. They sat across from each other, the sunlight pouring in from the window as George opened his notebook and laid everything on the table. Logs, notes, copies of invoices he'd quietly collected, even testimonials from residents who trusted him. Robert flipped through the pages, eyebrows rising higher with each entry. "This is solid documentation, George. Someone's been moving money around. And if I had to guess, it's tied to property value inflation before a sale." "So it's not just laziness?" George asked. "No," Robert replied, setting down the notebook. "It's exploitation. They're cutting costs to make profits look good on paper, then selling to the next investor at full price. Classic strip-and-sell tactic." George sat back, his pulse steady. "Can you do something about it?" Robert smiled faintly. "With your help, yes. You've given me the blueprint. Now let's see what we can rebuild." Over the next few weeks, Robert's small team began quietly researching the home's ownership structure. They discovered a shell company registered in the city, one of dozens controlled by a single investment group. The group had already started negotiating a sell-off to a larger corporation. Robert arranged for George to sit in on several virtual meetings under an alias, Mr. Miller, retired consultant. On the calls, George listened more than he spoke, offering subtle comments that carried the weight of lived experience. He explained why repair budgets shouldn't be slashed, why nursing staff turnover signals mismanagement, and why real care, not just clean balance sheets, made facilities valuable in the long run. The investors began to listen. For the first time, his voice mattered again, not as a retiree, not as a resident, as a man who understood what happens when people stop caring. One afternoon, after a long call, Robert called him directly. "You know, George, one of the investors asked today who you were. They said he speaks like someone who's been in the field for decades. I told them you were exactly that, a man who's seen what real work looks like." George chuckled. "I'm not trying to make waves, Robert." Robert's voice softened. "You're not. You're building something new. You just don't realize it yet." Meanwhile, Linda noticed the change in him. He walked taller, spoke clearer, even started mentoring other residents. When she brought him his evening coffee, she smiled and said, "You seem busier than most of the staff lately." He grinned. "Idle hands make for wasted days." At night, he'd sit by his window, looking out at the same parking lot lights that once felt like bars. Now they looked like opportunities, signals that something real was happening beyond the walls. Robert's team drafted a preliminary proposal, a buyout that would protect residents, ensure fair staffing, and restructure management with transparency. They called it Operation Renewal. When Robert showed George the draft, he placed it on the table like a gift. "You started this," he said. George looked down at the papers, emotions swelling quietly in his chest. "I just wrote what I saw." "That's where change begins," Robert replied, with someone who still pays attention. That night, as George closed his notebook and placed it beside the proposal papers, he realized something had shifted deep inside him. For years, people had treated him like a man nearing the end of his story. But now strangers in suits were discussing his ideas in boardrooms miles away. His words were being read, respected, and acted upon. He smiled, whispering into the still air of his room. "For the first time in years, someone listened, and I wasn't just a patient. I was the missing piece." He leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting in the soft lamplight. Somewhere between the broken lights of the hallway and the ticking of the clock, George Miller had found purpose again, not through revenge but through rebuilding. The press conference room buzzed with chatter, the kind that carries both excitement and nerves. Local reporters, staff members, and a few residents gathered in neat rows of folding chairs. Banners hung from the ceiling. New management, new vision. George stood quietly in the hallway outside, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp navy blue suit. It had been years since he'd worn one. The fabric felt both foreign and familiar, like shaking hands with an old part of himself. Inside, cameras flashed as the CEO of the parent company, a well-dressed man in his 50s, prepared to make the big announcement. "Today marks a new chapter for Silver Pines Living," he said, his tone polished. "After weeks of negotiation, we're officially transferring ownership to a group that values compassion, transparency, and community." George could hear every word through the cracked door. He felt calm, grounded, ready. Among the staff in the front row sat Linda, smiling softly, knowing what was about to unfold. A few seats over, Mark, his son, adjusted his tie and leaned toward the CEO. "We're thrilled to help make this transition smooth," he said confidently. Mark looked sharp. The same posture, the same confident grin, the same air of someone who believed he controlled the room. He had been hired by the previous investors as a consultant, brought in to help finalize the sale. He had no idea who was behind the deal. The CEO continued, "Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce someone very special, our new local partner, a man who understands this facility and its residents better than anyone, someone whose insight has shaped the entire acquisition plan." The room quieted. Cameras turned toward the door. It opened. And George walked in. The noise faded into a stunned silence. Mark's confident smirk disappeared in an instant. He blinked as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. "Dad?" George stopped at the center of the room, his steps steady, his gaze calm. The suit fit him perfectly. He wasn't the tired old man Mark had left behind at the retirement home. He was composed, assured, powerful in silence. He turned toward the CEO, shook his hand, then faced the crowd. "I live here," he said evenly, "and now I own it." The words hit the air like a thunderclap. Mark's jaw tightened. You own this place?" George nodded. "And a few more just like it. Turns out the company was undervalued, mismanaged by people who didn't care about people. Some of us decided that needed to change." The CEO stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Miller's integrity and insight were instrumental in the acquisition. His reports and first-hand understanding of operations helped us rebuild trust and accountability from the inside out." A few gasps spread through the room. Staff members exchanged looks, several nodding with quiet pride. George caught sight of Linda at the back, tears glinting in her eyes. She'd kept the secret well. Mark tried to regain composure. You were involved in this deal?" George looked at him, not with anger, but with something deeper. "I didn't want to be involved, son. I wanted to make things right. You see, when people forget what real work looks like, they start thinking titles are the same as worth." The silence stretched heavy across the room. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. One of the residents, an older man with a cane, began to clap. Slowly, others joined. Then the staff. Within seconds, the applause filled the room. Mark stood motionless, red creeping up his neck. For the first time, he looked small. Not because his father was greater, but because he finally saw what humility looked like. George didn't gloat. He simply nodded once to the crowd, a faint smile softening his expression. "This place isn't just a building," he said. "It's a promise, a reminder that no one is too small to be seen, and no one too old to matter." When the applause settled, reporters rushed forward for questions, but George held up a hand. "No statements, just one truth. Care should never be a business model, it should be a responsibility." Mark looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did all this while living here?" George met his eyes. "You left me here to rest, son, but I wasn't resting, I was rebuilding." The CEO smiled, shaking George's hand once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the new co-owner of Silver Pines, Mr. George Miller." The crowd rose in another wave of applause. Flashbulbs went off, capturing his calm face, his weathered hands, the quiet dignity of a man who'd been written off but never gave up. As he left the stage, Linda caught his arm and whispered, "You did it, George." He smiled faintly. "No, we did." Behind them, Mark stood alone, watching the father he once underestimated step into a spotlight built not by ego, but by integrity. That night, back in his room, George placed his old notebook on the nightstand. The pages were filled now. The evidence, the stories, the path to justice. He ran a hand over the cover, whispering softly to himself. He left me in a place he thought was my ending. It became the empire he could never touch. The hallways were silent now. The guests and cameras were gone, the echoes of applause fading into the still air. Only the low hum of the vending machine and the faint buzz of the lobby lights filled the quiet. George stood near the front window, looking out at the parking lot. A soft drizzle had begun to fall, coating the glass in streaks of silver. The reflection of the new ownership banner shimmered faintly behind him. He didn't turn when he heard the footsteps. "Dad?" Mark's voice was low, careful, the confidence from earlier gone. He stood by the doorway, shoulders tense, eyes red from more than just exhaustion. George didn't move. "You shouldn't be here this late." Mark exhaled shakily. "You embarrassed me today." Finally, George turned, his expression calm but unflinching. "No, son, I didn't embarrass you. You did that when you forgot where you came from." Mark's jaw tightened. "I was trying to help you. I didn't want you wasting away here." George took a slow step closer, his voice even. "No, you weren't trying to help me, Mark. You were trying to hide me. Because in your world, success only shines when there's no one older standing in its light." Mark looked away, eyes burning. "That's not true." George tilted his head slightly. "Isn't it? You called me old school, said I couldn't adapt. You put me here to fade quietly while you built something you thought was bigger, but you never stopped to think I was the one who built you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. Then Mark's shoulders slumped. His voice cracked when he spoke again. "I thought you'd given up." George's tone softened, but his words were steady. "No, I just stopped proving myself to people who stopped looking." Mark's eyes welled up as he sank into one of the lobby chairs. He looked smaller now, not the confident executive from earlier, but a son who'd lost his way somewhere between ambition and arrogance. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. "I just wanted to be respected. I wanted to make a name for myself." George nodded slowly. "And you did. But respect isn't taken, Mark. It's earned. And it's never earned by stepping on the shoulders that lifted you up." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek silver card. He placed it gently on the table beside his son. Mark picked it up, confused at first. The card gleamed under the soft lobby light. George Miller, founder, Haven Living Homes. Mark's hands trembled as he read it. "You started your own company?" George smiled faintly. "Robert and I partnered with some of the investors. We're rebuilding facilities like this one, with honesty, not greed. The residents will have a voice now. So will the staff." Mark looked up, eyes wet. "You really don't need me anymore, do you?" George shook his head. "That's not the point. I never wanted to leave you behind, Mark, but you left yourself behind a long time ago." The silence between them stretched again, heavy but not angry, just full of things long unsaid. George turned toward the window once more, watching the rain streak the glass. "You know," he said softly, "your mother used to tell me that life tests us twice, once when we fail and again when we succeed. The first test humbles you. The second reveals who you've become." Mark stood slowly. "Jana." Mark stood slowly, gripping the business card. His voice broke. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." George met his eyes. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, son. It's about understanding. I understand you now. You just have to understand yourself." Mark nodded silently, slipping the card into his pocket like something fragile. George placed a hand on his shoulder. "I didn't rise to prove you wrong, Mark," he said gently. "I rose to prove I was never done." Then he turned and walked toward the hallway, the soft sound of his steps fading behind him. Mark stood there for a long time, staring at the glass door, the reflection of his father's company name still glowing faintly in his hand. A reminder that dignity doesn't retire, and wisdom never fades. The morning sun poured through the wide windows of the newly renovated lobby. The walls were freshly painted. The air smelled of polish and coffee, and laughter echoed faintly down the hall, the kind of laughter that used to be rare in this place. The name on the sign above the entrance now read Haven Living Homes, founded by George Miller. George walked slowly through the hallway, cane in one hand, clipboard in the other. Staff members greeted him with smiles and small waves. The place felt alive again, cared for, seen, respected. Residents sat together near the garden windows, sharing stories, playing cards, reading aloud. The same cafeteria that once served cold food now buzzed with warmth and conversation. A framed newspaper article hung on the wall near the office. Former resident restores senior care chain to glory. Below the headline was a photo of George shaking hands with the new director, his calm, proud smile reflecting everything he'd rebuilt, not just the facility, but his sense of purpose. He paused to read it for a moment, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. It wasn't pride that filled him, it was peace. Down the hallway he heard a familiar voice. Dad. Mark stood by the door, no longer wearing expensive suits, no longer talking in boardroom tones. He carried a donation box labelled Haven Foundation Resident Assistance Fund. George smiled faintly. You're early. Mark nodded. Thought I'd help set up the charity booth. They began working side by side in silence, arranging flyers, stacking donation forms. The air between them was softer now, not filled with regret, but with quiet understanding. After a while, Mark said, I saw the article. You did something good here. George looked at him, eyes gentle. We did, son. Every hand that cared, every person who believed. It's never just one man's story. Mark hesitated, then added, I'm sorry for what I said, for what I did. George placed a hand on his shoulder. You already said it by being here. The two shared a quiet smile before Mark went off to greet the guests arriving for the Foundation's event. George stayed behind for a moment, watching him go, the pride returning, not the kind that sought recognition, but the kind that forgives. Later, in his small office, George sat at his desk. On the polished wooden surface sat a photo of his late wife, Linda, her eyes warm, her smile eternal. Beside it lay the folded business card he once carried with resentment. Miller Real Estate Group, building tomorrow. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing it flat against the desk. The creases faded under his hand, and with them so did the last traces of bitterness. He whispered softly, Tomorrow finally arrived. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, not counting time lost but time redeemed. Outside his office, the sound of laughter returned again. Residents chatting, nurses talking, music playing from a small radio. George looked toward the window, sunlight reflecting in his eyes. Sometimes, he said quietly, being left behind is how you find where you truly belong. He leaned back, breathing in the peace he had built, not through revenge, but through redemption. Then, with a small knowing smile, he added, Revenge ends when truth stands tall. The camera of life seemed to fade on that image, a man surrounded by light, legacy, and the sound of second chances finally earned.